Hi, I'm Vanessa and I love bad Star Trek. I love all Trek really, so I am breaking down the bad and the ugly so you don't have to watch it. Star Trek is a vast 50-year franchise and a lot of it is truly wonderful, but some really stinks. I will be the abandoned babies that is Star Trek Voyager. Today, I will be talking to you about one of my favorite bad episodes in the entire franchise, Threshold, whose writing is iconically terrible. The plot is full of pointless detours, and even by the writer's own admission, it doesn't have a point. It seems like a normal episode in the beginning, especially if you close your eyes, but if you dare let this enter your eyeballs after a certain point, especially midway through, I just hope you aren't in the middle of eating. It's even more Cronenberg inspired, honestly, than Conspiracy. If you Google Threshold, you will discover that this is widely considered to be the worst Voyager episode. And I honestly think that depends on your criteria, because I think Jetrel is way worse. Nearly an hour of a genocidal maniac whining about cancel culture ain't really my jam. Threshold is the 15th episode of the second season. And at that point, they still hadn't really developed Tom Paris's character. But the writers thought that this could be fixed by featuring this character heavily in an episode. And they accomplished this by using a very well-worn Star Trek trope, putting someone through some really bad shit. For example, it's kind of a running joke on Deep Space Nine that Miles O'Brien is just put through everything. He goes to prison, he gets tortured, he gets beat, he's kidnapped, just all the time. To give a quick summary, Tom Paris is Voyager's horny, ex-Maquis frat boy pilot who fell into the job after the ship found itself stuck in the Delta Quadrant and the original pilot Stottie died and we never hear about her again. And when Tom is not at the helm, he is obsessed with having Ensign Kim watch him get laid and is often moody and is prone to bitching about his overbearing Starfleet Admiral father. The kind of guy who clearly needs years of therapy, who you might think you could fix if you just love him enough. Just like any pretty bad boy who can drive. So Tom Paris is like a walking cliche and comes across as a far less mature, ambitious, or dignified Commander Riker. So do they take Threshold as an opportunity to develop Tom's character and not just be an unmanned fire hose of random emotion and impulses? No, they do not. In fact, not only is everything Tom says completely without substance, the longer that Tom Paris is on screen, the less coherent he becomes. Literally. Like a lot of terrible Voyager episodes, the writers just have a science-adjacent idea that doesn't need to be put on screen and throw dialogue on top. The end product was not what supervising producer Brandon Braga had envisioned. But even if he managed to get his point across, it would still be bad. There's no saving this at all, really. Braga thought it would be cool for Star Trek to explore the idea that evolution would not necessarily be progressive and propel humans into having bigger brains and more intellect, but instead we could de-evolve into salamanders. There's nothing scientific about that, and this gets to the core of a deep misunderstanding within a lot of Trek about what evolution is, that it means better or more sophisticated, that evolution will inevitably go in a certain direction that we can predict right now. So that actually doesn't really make sense. Salamanders have adapted to survive in the present time, same as people, so we're not superior. Consciousness is just an adaptive trait. Like, yeah, sure, salamanders don't have Twitter and paychecks and wine racks, but they can grow shit back. And people will fully know that we should not do something and do it anyway. Salamanders are not nearly as determined to be openly moronic as we are in the pursuit of being right, which is at the crux of this episode, traveling at the speed of light using warp speed is how starships in Star Trek travel from one star system to another. And the number, like warp 1, warp 2, is meant to be how many more times the speed of light you're going. And warp 10 is supposed to be like an impossible speed. Gene Roddenberry, Trek's creator, decided on just arbitrarily making that the limit. So B'Elanna, Harry Kim, and Tom Paris are trying to cross the threshold and have been working on this project for a month because they're in the Delta Quadrant, which is 75 years from home at high warp. So going faster is a very attractive prospect. And in the mess hall, we learned that they won't just go faster at warp 10, travel would actually be instantaneous, so they could go home at the push of a button.
It means that you would occupy every point in the universe simultaneously. In theory, you could go any place in the wink of an eye. Time and distance would have no meaning.
And after the cold open and working out some of the kinks in the simulations, they eventually do cross the threshold in the holodeck and use this evidence to convince Janeway to let them run a manned test, because Voyagers just got shuttles for days and of course they can spare one. Even if both Commander Chakotay and Captain Janeway say that this has all been very fantastic and theoretical up to this point, but the results are undeniable and it's certainly worth a try. Janeway also mentions to Tom the great prestige that would be bestowed on him for piloting the very first transwarp flight.
Well, good luck, Mr. Paris. If this works, you'll be joining an elite group of pilots. Orville Wright, Neil Armstrong, Zephram Cochrane, and Tom Paris.
I kind of like the way that sounds.
But of course, in the next scene, Janeway is in Tom Paris's quarters and says that the doctor did some scans and found that there might be an enzyme imbalance, so there's probably a 2% chance that he'll have a brain hemorrhage if he does this transwarp flight. And Ensign Kim doesn't have this imbalance, so he should probably do it. And Tom does not take this well.
2%? I'll take that chance.
There's no reason to.
Giving reasons like, this is my flight. Like, that's not accurate. Followed by one of the more groan-worthy speeches on Voyager.
When I was a boy, my father used to tell me that I was special. That one day I'd do something significant. My teachers at school, all the kids, everyone used to say, Tom Paris is going to do something important when he grows up.
The honest version of this speech would be, but the prestige and the Mount Kilimanjaro's a vagina that I will climb, and my dad will finally love me, and I might even end up loving myself. So this is totally worth dying for. You know, this gives me very millennial existential crisis realness. Like, we're pumped with platitudes about how special we are from day one, and then grow up to be horrified that we are ordinary with debt and depression. I don't know why Janeway even had this meeting. She's the captain. She can just decide that Kim's doing it instead without consulting with Tom at all. But some kid a long time ago said Tom was special, and Tom went pretty please, so he gets to do it. Nothing changes, so this scene is completely pointless. Tom takes off in the shuttle and runs the experiment, and then as he crosses the transwarp threshold, he disappears off of the sensors, which alarms the bridge. But this was explained earlier. Why would they forget that he was going to be at every point in the universe at once? I think that's a detail I would remember. But he comes back and he's unconscious, so he gets beamed into sickbay. And honestly, the only thing that makes this worth watching is the EMH. He's always a delight to watch, even in the worst Voyager episodes.
From what I can tell, he's just asleep.
Can you wake him?
I don't see why not. Wake up, Lieutenant!
Robert Picardo, the actor who plays him, recently gave away free autographs to those who got vaccinated earlier this month, which I think is fucking awesome. So far, at this point, Tom seems okay. He just tells Janeway about his experience being at every point in the universe at once. Janeway and B'Elanna download the sensor logs, and the one load-bearing thing that happens here is that they now have a complete star chart of the sector. So at this point, you'd think this seems kind of ordinary, like a promising, maybe mediocre episode, but that changes real fast when Tom Paris drinks some coffee that Neelix blended in his honor, and he finds out that he has an adverse reaction, and in sickbay he discovers that he's allergic to water. And the EMH's scans find that Tom Paris's DNA is mutating in a way that he can't counteract because he doesn't really understand what's going on or why it's happening, other than it obviously is connected with the transwarp thing. Tom is literally turning green around the gills and can't even breathe oxygen anymore. So while he's being bombarded with radiation and realizing that he's probably going to die, he starts to ramble. And again, Tom Paris's vulnerability, because of how it's written, comes across as trite and ironic.
Big funeral. Lots of pretty girls all crying. Except Taurus. Taurus doesn't cry. Do you ever notice that? I don't trust people who don't cry. Of course, my father, he'd say crying is a sign of weakness. I never believed that.
The writers here are handed a space for Tom to be something other than superficial and egotistical, and they failed. His vulnerability seems very performative, like validate me, love me, and that's sad, but in the wrong way.
What I remember most about being a kid are the times I spent in my room crying. I like my room, no. It was quiet in there. I lost my virginity in that room. 17. Parents were away for the weekend.
I'll note that in your medical file.
The EMH tries to break up the moment with some levity, but then Tom starts showing how far gone his mind truly is.
Pepperoni! God, I'd love a pepperoni pizza with Bavarian olives right now. I'm starving!
Pepperoni is way overrated. They're like these little pieces of skin that curl up in the oven and spoon grease into your mouth, one tiny droplet at a time. Honestly, I think they're pretty gross. But then Tom blurts out something else that makes everyone uncomfortable.
Kiss me. What? Not you, her.
She can't breathe the atmosphere in here.
Consider it a last request.
Sorry, Tom, if we let down the force field, you'll suffocate.
Kes is saved by the poison gas chamber that Paris is currently breathing, but then he dies. And watching this episode again made me realize that the only way this episode could have been improved is if Tom Paris actually died, like stayed dead. Kes had a very strong friendship with him, and so you can feel her loss here. There's this tiny gesture that the EMH makes of almost putting his hand onto her shoulder for comfort, but pulling away. And that little movement made this scene mean something. But Tom Paris revives somehow, and the EMH announces to Tom that he now has 2 hearts.
Two hearts that beat as one. 2 hearts. I need you, I need you. 2 hearts. 2 hearts that beat as one. 2 hearts. Come on, come on.
So now we're back in wacky territory. Like it sucked the weight out of what that previous beat had. Meanwhile, we get another pointless scene that goes nowhere, where an engineer that overheard B'Elanna and Janeway talking about Warp 10 and engineering is secretly in contact with Voyager's enemy, the Kazon, telling this captain guy, like, yeah, Tom crossed the threshold and did transwarp flight, and I can send you the files about it to prove my worth. And the Kazon are like, wait, Tom actually survived that? Engineer says something a little sketchy.
You survived?
In a manner of speaking, it's all on file.
in a manner of speaking is a very bizarre way to describe someone's DNA being completely rewritten and not being able to breathe oxygen while growing a new heart. That's leaving out a lot. If I was on the market for a car and the person selling it to me said, it worked in a manner of speaking, I wouldn't buy it. It probably has 3 wheels and no roof. I don't know if this engineer defects to join the Kazon, but if he does, it's not in this episode. It's highly likely that this go nowhere B plot was included to have the episode not be completely in sickbay, but it's a dead end, as is Tom Paris's prognosis.
His internal organs are being rearranged.
So it's weird to hear that here. I usually hear that as a deeply unsavory way to describe sex. But the EMH is completely flummoxed about how Tom's body is transforming in increasingly dramatic ways. Tom is growing things the EMH can't even identify. And Janeway is told that Tom has only the flimsiest grasp of cogitation, that he's becoming deranged, and that trying to have a conversation with him might not be a great idea, but she does it anyway. Tom looks like he's a mix between the last of those Faces of Meth pictures and Jim Carrey and the Cable Guy.
Silence of the lambs.
And this conversation goes nowhere good. Janeway is telling him what the EMH already said, and Tom is continuing to regress to this infantile state where he's like, no one likes me, everybody will be happy when I'm gone. It's fishing for attention in these grandiose, desperate ways. It's really cringy to watch someone flailing pathetically like this. She should have just left the EMH to do his job. But in the middle of saying something really destructive, he actually pulls out his tongue. So either Janeway casts some kind of curse on him, or we can make peace with the fact that this episode has truly crossed a line and there's no going back. So now we have Tom on the floor without a tongue making more demands.
Let me out of here,
I'm afraid that's not possible.
please.
Like, I gotta get off of this fruit, which is what a person actually without a tongue would say. I think he's a little too articulate for someone without a tongue. That's just me being picky. At this point, honestly, I just feel pity for the actor. Did Robert McNeil, the guy who plays Tom Paris, piss someone off? Why doesn't Chakotay lose his tongue and flail around with his skin falling off? The look that Tom Paris had on his face when he pulled it out too, like with this sick glee, is so unsettling. Ugh. So the EMH is like, we basically gotta hook him up to the ship's car battery and remove his new DNA so the old DNA can be expressed. And I don't think that's how DNA works. But okay, so by this point, he's completely turned into a turtle with a beak, at least in the face. And while they're trying to save him, he breaks free from his restraints in engineering, and from sickbay you could see like phaser fire. So he's out of control and he's super strong, and he escapes from engineering, kidnaps Janeway, and takes her into a shuttle going transwarp. And 3 days later, Voyager finally tracks down the shuttle on some uninhabited planet, and the EMH describes what happened to Tom as natural. Everything the EMH says here is just so far off.
The changes in his DNA are consistent with the evolutionary development of the human genotype observed over the past 4 million years. Increased brain capacity, the loss of vestigial organs.
Are you saying Lieutenant Paris is evolving?
That's my theory.
That's not how evolution works. Generations of mutations just can't be activated in one organic being. And like, we don't have our future mutations just in us ready to be woof like that. Yeah. Oh, you're like, this can't get any worse, right? Oh, yes, it can. When Chakotay and Tuvok beam down to where the shuttle is, and they find 2 very large salamanders that they identify as Janeway and Paris, who they hit with this stun. And right between them is a little hole with baby salamanders in it. I'm glad that for something so visually repulsive they spared us the sight of watching them make these babies. Thank you. And Chakotay, though he is a racist stereotype, says something kind of funny.
I don't know how I'm going to enter this into the log.
I look forward to reading it.
Chakotay beams back Salamander, Paris, and Janeway and decides to leave the babies in their habitat, abandoning them for life. And the EMH removes their mutant DNA and they're both back to normal. So now Janeway and Paris have a conversation that is pretty necessary at this point. Robert Duncan, who plays Paris, helped write this scene because when he got the script, he justifiably was like, I can't even believe we're doing this. And this makes no sense. So how about we actually resolve this somehow? That doesn't really mean it's good because they're processing a completely wacky and unnecessary chain of events.
Captain, I'm sorry. I don't know what to say, except I don't remember very much about, you know.
What makes you think it was your idea? Sometimes it's the female of a species that initiates mating.
Like, just imagine that you had accidentally passed out and 3 days later, you managed to mate with your boss and make babies as a salamander. And Tom at the end is like, you know what? I did do something. Yeah. Stuff. So this episode is basically the story of Icarus, but instead of his wings melting, his tongue falls out. This doesn't need to exist at all, but I'm honestly glad it does in all its pointless, increasingly disgusting glory. But it's unfortunate that the only thing that devolves is Tom Paris's character. I came out of this knowing less about him, except that he's into objectively vile things like pepperoni. By the way, these babies never get mentioned again, so he's just perpetuated the cycle of emotional neglect. Like, subscribe, no pressure, but peer pressure. Till next time, I guess.